Go ahead and start with the full introduction of what I am doing for today. So once again, welcome to the Breakdown with Birkenoff. I am your host, Wyatt Birkenoff. And this is my day number 2 about voter fraud and just trying to learn the history about it. And we kept hearing about voter ID laws throughout my first episode as a type of restriction some states have put, or a type of idea in order to reduce voter fraud. And I thought that this new voter ID topic deserved a stream just by itself. So that's kind of what I was going to do for today, because I do think that it really deserves an entire stream just on its topic, because it really is a big topic out there in politics that I've always heard, but I don't necessarily know a whole lot about, really. So I wanted to kind of dive in and see for myself why voter ID laws are good or bad, and the reasons for each result. So quickly, I wanted to briefly mention what I covered on my first stream about the type of voter ID restrictions. And the first one they had, according to heritage.org, is the one that voter ID laws work in particular. Because one of the major reasons really for voter ID laws that you always hear about is that they reduce actual fraud because of having to prove that your vote is that vote through a driver's license or passport or some sort of ID that proves you are that person who is casting the vote 100% for sure, and it can't be anyone else. So it just makes sure that the vote that's cast for that particular person is who they say they are. I guess you could think of it in that. You could think of it in that way. So heritage.org defined impersonation act fraud as a type of voting fraud. And they said here with their definition: impersonation fraud at the polls, voting in the name of other legitimate voters and voters who have died, moved away, or lost their right to vote because they are felons but remain registered. So there are a few different examples they give on a type of impersonation at the fraud polls that you could see. And we always hear about dead people voting in almost every election that I at least have been politically into. Now, I'm only 20 years old myself, so I haven't really paid attention to too many elections, because really in middle school and whatever else, politics was not so much my interest till in high school. So really I only paid attention to recent politics from that point on. But I do know some history of past elections of George, Kennedy, and all the other ones down the line. Now, I'm definitely not an expert, but I do know that in almost at least every recent example of elections have had some sort of claim about dead people voting, and you mostly hear about dead people voting in the state of Florida. They had a major problem of that in 2018 and 2016. It may have been 2016 or 2018. I could have those dates mixed up, or both. But I do know that I have definitely heard Florida having claims of impersonation through dead people voting in that state. So that is a type of voting fraud for sure. But then the question becomes, how just big of the scope is impersonation with fraud a type of voting fraud? In other words, what percentage of voter fraud does impersonation take? And then with that percentage, how many people have we seen in elections in the past been impersonated, or how much fraud does impersonation actually have? There was definitely a better way of saying that, but I think you get what I'm kind of going around. Because in my first stream, where I just looked at the history of voting fraud and examples in the past, and just to see just how big the scope was, that was one of the questions I wanted to cover, was just how big is the issue, and is it something that we should be concerned about? Obviously, you want every election to run smoothly. You want every election to make sure that the person you casted your vote for counts, or the person just as a community, you want to make sure as a community that every vote someone votes for is allowed, is right. There's no illegal votes. There's no fraud. There's no impersonation. There's no votes that shouldn't be there are changing of votes that shouldn't be there. And impersonation is a type of voting fraud that we covered in the first stream, but wasn't so much a huge scope or something that I kept seeing, but it definitely kept getting referred to. So that brings you to the question of just how big is impersonation fraud and what is the scope of it? Well, this is where you get into a very large debate, because according to many studies and many scientific journals or journal papers we are going to read later on, talk about just the scope and what we might be seeing for the type of frauds that we should expect with impersonation fraud. And those who may have watched my last stream are going to watch it on YouTube real quick before we dive 100% into it. I am going to make summaries of both of these streams. I might make a summary of both together for my YouTube channel, but if it gets too long, I might have to split them into two separate YouTube videos. But I do think it's important for those who may not want to spend an hour and a half, 2 hours, 2 hours and 30 minutes, however long it might take, trying to figure out voting fraud through voter IDs or just voting fraud in its history and what's happening now. I want to make a summarized version for those people that just don't have the time to necessarily have the discussion with me through this entire time. So I am going to make summary versions of each. But one of the things I'm definitely going to have to include in the summary versions of probably both of these videos is this website here, where they have summarized many different points or journals or statistics off of voting fraud. And really this entire website or organization, as you see from the top title there, of the Birmingham Center for Justice of 20 Years, a New York University School of Law, they have all of their sites and references from, like I said, scientific journals or journal articles in scientific research and whatnot, of claims that voter fraud isn't as big as you would think it would be. So they talk about all that for how that goes. Anyway, I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself, but I'm definitely going to include many of these articles in that topic. And one of the big things they talked about was impersonation fraud. And I'm going to quickly find the particular thing I wanted to point out. Let me do a search real quick so we're not spending too much time. Okay, here we go. The Birmingham Center for a Similar report on this issue, The Truth About Voter Fraud, found the most reported instances of voter fraud are actually traceable to other sources, such as clerical errors or bad data matching practices. The report reviewed elections that have been meticulously studied for voter fraud and found incident rates of 0.003% and 0.0025%. Given this tiny incident rate for voter impersonation fraud, it is more likely that the report noted that an American will be struck by lightning than it will be to impersonate another voter at the polls. So that was one of the major claims that gets summarized in this particular data source where this university collected results for voter fraud and the total scope of it, as I have been talking about. But we're going to quickly go to this study and see if we can learn some more information about that in particular. But I do want to make sure I quickly state that I don't think any American wants any vote not to count or to count against them or to be changed. Basically, long story short, no American wants voter fraud to exist in their election. That is something that is very important and needs to make sure that it doesn't happen in order for Americans to believe the election results and for elections to continue the way they have been in the past, if that makes sense. But basically what I'm trying to say is no American wants their election system to be run so badly that they can no longer trust what they actually see. So therefore, any sort of voter fraud needs to be reduced as much as possible, because again, nobody wants their election results to have a possibility of going the other direction or have a possibility of really any fraud for that matter. So let's read this entire section of what they had to say, because I don't want to have anything out of context for what we just read about more likely to get struck by lightning. So we'll continue on here. Allegations of election-related fraud makes for exciting press. Many Americans remember vivid stories of voting impersonations in Chicagoland, or the surprisingly sudden appearance of LBJ's alphabetized ballot box in Texas, or Governor Earl Long's quip, "When I die, I want to be buried in Louisiana so I can stay active in politics." Voter fraud in particular has been the fuel of bank heist capper, roundly committed but technically fascinating, and significantly lured the grab and hold headlines. Perhaps because these stories are dramatic, voter fraud makes a popular scapegoat in the aftermath of a close election. Losing candidates often are quick to blame voter fraud for the results. Legislators cite voter fraud as jurisdiction for various new restrictions on the exercise of the franchise, and pundits trot out the same new few anecdotes time and time again as proof of the wave of fraud as imminent. Allegations of widespread voter fraud, however, often prove greatly exaggerated. It is easy to grab headlines with a lurid claim. Tens of thousands may be voting illegally. The follow-up, when any exists, is not usually deemed newsworthy, yet closer examination, many of the claims of voter fraud amount to a great deal of smoke without much fire. The allegations simply do not pan out. And this is from the Birmingham Center for Justice. And those who've watched my stream yesterday about voter fraud and its history, there are a ton of claims of recent voter fraud and past voter fraud, so I can't necessarily say that what they're saying here is 100% truthful, really, but at the same time, the scope of voter fraud, depending on how you look at it, could be so less that it doesn't particularly matter as much as many people think. So I think that also needs to be taken into account for as well. So it just kind of depends on what you think of voter fraud in general. But really, any claim of voter fraud or any voter fraud that has exist needs to be something that gets greatly reduced, because no fraud would be the ideal way for any election. So it is interesting to have that sort of approach. But then you get the side where, in particular, when we're talking about today with voter ID laws, many people claim that there's just not enough voter fraud really to exist out there to have stricter and stricter laws to make voting harder for people, because the pure thought of making it hard for people, a lot of people argue, is un-American, because every American should have the right to vote. But then again, you get the people on the other side that say voting is a I don't want to say privilege, but I think that there's a right that every American has to vote. And a lot of people take voting super seriously and think that their vote means legislation, and regardless, their vote is important, and everyone should value their vote as important, and it shouldn't just be something that Americans shrug off, because really only 50% or less of Americans really even vote in America. The turnout of voting is very low compared to a lot of other nations. In some nations, I believe Australia is one of the nations that requires people to at least cast a ballot, but I do believe in Australia you have an option to say you don't like any candidate, or essentially go and say I don't vote, but you have to at least show up and cast your ballot that way. But so there's a law for that type of thing. I don't know if a law like that would pass in the United States, but it is something that is rather interesting. I've heard many people argue that the idea of having the day off and to cast your vote would be something that would promote more Americans to vote. And I do think that a day off would actually be a strategy or an idea that could pass in the United States, and it's something that is very important, because again, voting is something we should take extremely serious. But again, like I said on my last stream, and I say a lot of times on my podcast or on my YouTube, local elections matter, and voter fraud happens more in the local elections, and especially voter IDs, depending how you look at it. And as we dive more in and to understand the voter ID argument, could either suppress more votes or be a good idea, depending on what side of the aisle you're from or how you view voting in America. Do you think voting should be a little bit more restrictive, or do you think voting should be there for everybody? And I see Tank Bobo on Twitch, and he says that's stupid. Just vote if you don't support anybody. And then he says only few only fools vote for that. Yeah, that is a good point, but I do like that Australia, if it is the case, and I do believe it is the case in Australia, but I could definitely be wrong, but I do believe that is an option they have if they don't necessarily know about a lot of candidates to vote for basically nobody, but they at least have to show up and vote. And it is an interesting idea because I do think a lot of people don't necessarily know a lot about candidates when they go to vote, especially when you're talking about a presidential election. Because in politics, we oftentimes, when we go into the vote, especially for the president, we go down the ticket. We vote by party. A lot of Americans do that. Not many Americans will go across the aisle when it comes to their governor, or across the aisle when it comes to their senator, or across the aisle when it comes to their representative, and so on. You get the point. The more you go down, the more people are willing just to vote by their party because they don't really know about what that candidate wants to support. So it is a very interesting idea because in general, I think people would like to be informed and to think that people are informed when they go to vote. But there's a lot of people that just vote because they've always been Democrat or because people have told them to vote for this person and don't necessarily take the time to research it just for themselves. But I don't think that's an issue that just America has. I think every nation that allows for voting, or really every nation period, has that same problem. So that is an interesting idea and not one that I think necessarily changes that much. But then again, I am for the idea of having a day off for Americans to vote because I do think it would allow for higher voter turnout because many people simply don't have the time or whatever other excuse you can come up with for casting a ballot on that particular day. But that's not so much the focus we have for today's stream. So let's get into some ideas of voter identification requirements. Now this does depend on the state because several states have slightly stricter modifications to their voter ID laws, while other states don't have any voter ID law. So it just depends on your state in particular, where this kind of gives an overview of some voter ID requirements that some states have or a lot of states have in common. So I'll go ahead and read the introduction here. A total of 36 states have laws requesting or requiring voters to show up with some form of identification at the polls, 35 of which are in force in 2020. North Carolina's law has a temporary injunction on it as of December 31st, 2019. The remaining 14 states use other methods to verify the identification of voters. Most frequently, other identifying information provided at the polling place, such as signature, is checked against the information on file. Proponents see increasing requirements for identification as a way to prevent in-person voter impersonation and increase public confidence in the election process. Opponents say that there is little fraud of this kind, and the burden on voters usually restricts the right to vote and imposes unnecessary costs and administrative burdens on election administrators. So then they have a little bit of a map. But before I go on to that, it is important to think about voter IDs laws in this perspective. And we're going to hear a lot of these same sort of arguments because it's really the main two approaches that come from voter ID laws. You have the side that says that voter ID laws are restrictive and target the black community and Latino community, and they think that there shouldn't be voter ID laws because the more Americans that cast a vote, the more of a whole nation America really is. Then you have the other side that say that every vote should matter, yes, but every voter should have an identification, such as a driver license, so that we can ensure that no fraud exists in our election, or less fraud exists in our election. But the whole debate becomes if you value that number, or if you don't value the number. And what I mean by the number is the statistics of voter fraud through impersonation. If you believe that that number should be reduced or not happen at all, then you are most likely to side with some sort of voter ID law. But if you believe that that law shouldn't be there and more people should have the opportunity to vote, then voter ID and the number of voter impersonation doesn't really mean that much. And I see that Tank has a more comment here. He says, getting out of your house, spending 5 minutes in the bus, showing up there, getting quick instructions for overwhelming, sophisticated technology, crying about nothing happens when you click 3,475 times. After nothing happens when you click. Whoops, sorry, just read it. Giving up. Calling the girl who works overtime to press the button for you and spending 5 more minutes in the bus back home, as well as getting evil looks from the neighbors for voting. Nobody. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure exactly what you mean by all that, but the whole idea of voting and voting ID laws are interesting, and I think what you're meaning is the process of voting doesn't really take that much effort. And I do think that you do have a pretty good claim there. I don't 100% really necessarily agree with anybody that says, well, I'm too busy to vote. Because especially with early voting, and especially with this election in 2020 here for the President Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, there were so many early voting days that you would have to be basically living under a rock not to cast a vote in person, really. But then if you're somebody that's taking COVID seriously, which is what you probably should be doing, because COVID is a pretty big virus, as anybody knows. But if you're taking COVID seriously and you don't want to vote in person because you're at risk or you might affect somebody, there's plenty of opportunities to cast a mail-in ballot. So this election may have been something that's a little different, but even if you just take a regular election with no COVID and nothing out extreme going on, you had plenty of opportunity through early voting or the physical day to cast a vote. So I don't really think that voting is necessarily that hard. But we'll get into some specifics about voter identification. Voter ID laws can be categorized in 2 ways. First, the laws can be sorted by whether the state asks for a photo ID or whether it accepts IDs without a photo as well. Second, the law can be divided by actions are available for voters who do not have ID. These 2 categorization schemes can add up and do overlap. Photo versus non-photo identification. Some states request or require voters to show up identification document that has a photo on it, such as a driver's license, state-issued identification card, military ID, and tribal ID, and other forms of ID, like a passport. And by the way, I live in Texas, and that is a law in Texas that you have to show an ID with a photo. And really a lot of Americans and a lot of Texans have a driver's license, so you simply just show your driver's license. And if you have the ID, this doesn't really prevent you from voting at all. It's just another step maybe in your way to cast a vote. But really, it took like 1 minute. I literally gave her the ID, she looked at it, and then gave it back to me. It was very fast. All she looked for is the date and the photo. So, I mean, there's not that much that goes on to that particular component of voting ID. But if you don't have a voter ID and you're someone that thinks of these laws as being suppressive, as we'll get into a little bit later, that's an entire argument that I think I'll save that perspective to an article I have, because I want to argue with and against its points when we get there. But we'll continue on here. Other states accept non-photo identification, such as a bank statement with a name and address or other document that does not necessarily have a photo. Using this categorization for laws that are in effect in 2020, 18 states asked for a photo ID, although North Carolina is on hold based on a preliminary injunction from a federal judge. And this article is a little old, so I don't know if North Carolina necessarily has a photo identification or not. We could pick on that state, but I think that the map is going to be old as well, because I think this article was written... Well, no, this article was updated in 2020, so they might have updated map on that one too. So let's get into their main points here. Okay, so this was the main table I wanted to show. So the states that are strict with voter ID are Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. The states that are non-strict that have voter ID are Arkansas, Alabama, Florida, Hawaii, Idaho, Louisiana, Michigan, North Carolina, Rhode Island, South Carolina, South Dakota, and Texas. So Tank here says, so if I am 16 and get $20 ID to buy some beer, I can vote as well. Well, if you're in America, you can't buy liquor until you're 21, so that wouldn't work. Now, if you're talking about buying a fake ID, and that's a whole nother that's a whole nother topic, and really that comes to the fraud of the particular voting people at the polls. So there's a lot of claims about On my first stream, I talked about voter fraud, and this one is in particular with IDs. But to answer your question here, I think it's best to talk about the biggest example of voter fraud, and we're even going to get to that on a video I have later as well. But the main example that he claims, and the main example that I've really seen, is two types of main voter fraud. Either you have the voter fraud do ballots, or the candidate themselves that signs extra ballots or makes people vote towards him instead of somebody else. Then you have the other claim of people that simply are making mistakes, or maybe even on purpose making mistakes. And I would be looking at the ID that is fake. There was an example, I believe it was in Florida, or I may have the state wrong, but there was an example where a high school student showed up, including one high school student that gave the person their report card, and the voter person, what do you call them, your poster, or whatever, the person that makes sure you're that person, passed them through just based off of his report card, although he was under the age of 18 to vote in America. So I guess necessarily so if you're 16, you're under 18, so you can't vote. But to answer your question about buying alcohol, you have to be 21, so that's a little different. But that just came to my mind as well, of the fact that you can be 18 and vote, obviously. But so then you have to show your ID for that, of being 18. So anyway, I think that kind of answers your question either way. Alrighty. So then you have your states that don't require a photo ID, and those being strict ones, being Arizona, North Dakota, and Ohio. Then you have Alaska, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, Montana, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Utah, Virginia, Washington, and West Virginia as being states that don't require a non-photo ID that are also non-strict. So that is a very interesting concept from the types of voter ID, and mainly when you talk about voter ID, it's mainly, as you saw before, a driver's license or passport or some sort of verification with a photo. But even in examples where you don't require a photo, make you have some sort of, like they said, a bank statement that have your name and probably address that you can confirm. So it's an interesting idea, just to make sure that every vote that's cast in person is who you say they are. But we are going to be getting to evidence of supposed voter suppression about voter ID laws here in a little bit. And thank you as well for your follow, Tank. I highly appreciate that. Unfortunately, my sound notifications aren't working. I've been trying to figure that out, but my computer is not being very friendly. So sorry that I don't have any sort of sound, but thank you for your follow. I see you there. So we'll get into this article by USA Gov a little bit more, and we're going to see the same sort of ideas about voter ID laws and specifics on requirements. But what I'm trying to say is basically we're going to see the same sort of things we saw in the last article, but I thought it was important to get one from a different site and not just from the other site, because the other one was a little bit more of a blog, and this one is actually by the government themselves. And yes, you can share the link, Tank, and you should be able to post a link for sure, yes. So let's see. We'll go to this type of article here. So they have basically some shortened answers about what in particular. See, the problem with voter ID itself and the physical laws that happen is really two parts to understand. The first part is there's no sort of federal governments that comes into requiring what you have to do and what you can't do, because elections are mainly given to the states to decide on legislation or rules to how you then cast your vote. So there is some basic federal guidelines, I would say, about how elections are generally run, but not really to the point of determining exactly what each state has to do. So the voter ID laws are mainly determined by which state you live in, and it is something that can be rather concerning for sure when you're talking about the specifics of what voter ID law in particular you're talking about. And I see your ID for your picture you posted there. So I don't know exactly what you're trying to say through there, but I'm assuming this is probably a fake ID or maybe not a fake ID, but I'm not sure exactly what you're trying to say through that picture. So if you can say that, I would appreciate that. But yeah, it really determines on your state and in its specifics. But if we're talking in general, we can talk about the difference between a photo ID and not a photo ID. So you have your photo IDs between a driver's license, a state issued ID, a military ID, or a passport, and then you have your examples of non-photo IDs through birth certificates, social security cards, bank statements, and utility bills. Now, an interesting topic that I just thought of, what I didn't necessarily think of beforehand, and this is why I kind of do these discussions. I do research and whatnot beforehand to make sure I get all these articles up and kind of understand it and everything. But the main topic or the main approach is I'm thinking out loud and trying to understand this. And that's why I wanted to do this specific on voter ID, because I've heard it from every side, from conservatives to liberals, talking about voter IDs, but I didn't really know any information particularly for myself. Now, the point I was trying to think of here before I kind of made that disclaimer, if you want to say that, is I wonder if these bank statements and birth certificates are an idea to also prevent voter impersonation, because it does seem like it's a relatively good idea just to make sure that you are who you are through a bank statement more than just a photo ID. But at the same time, I could see a ID that actually has your photo and your information through age and whatnot, and where you live through numbers for the system would lead to less voter impersonation just because it has that extra step of a photo. But I don't know if that number is big enough to really make that much of a difference. And you say it's a voting pass for a 15-year-old. Yeah, let me look at the picture real quick. I pulled it up on my stream, but I have my second computer here. But I can pull it up on the stream too here in a little bit. But yeah, you see their expiration date of birth is 06/03/1981. So you're basically, if I'm understanding this right, this person is 15 years old, but made a fake ID claiming an age that he was eligible to vote. So then you're talking more about voter fraud through posters, where it may not even be an effort based on that person. Anyway, retract. Let me try to make it more sense in my head and to you. Basically, you can easily make a fake ID that has your age being of age, and a person could look at it and look at your birth date and where you live through its numbers and whatnot and say, yes, this person is who they say they are, yet you are still underage to actually cast that ballot. But then you're talking about something a little bit different. You're talking about voter fraud through posters and the people that work the desk. And that's something that is interesting, and as I said briefly before, is the most common example of voter fraud in this country, really, is simply people doing it on purpose or casting their vote for making a mistake, because human nature is its biggest adversary when it comes to voting. And that's also why a lot of people argued on the first stream with mail-in ballots that it was simply people's error through being human or during the transportation between point A to point B that could lead to voter fraud through mail-in ballots, and why that system is bad from the start. But that is a whole separate topic, but then it leads to the same sort of problem through people being its main fault of how voter fraud could exist. And in particular with voting IDs, it is very possible that you bring a fake ID, the person looks at it, because like I told you with my anecdotal experience, it wasn't like she was looking at it for a minute. She literally looked at the date, looked at the photo, looked at me, and handed it back. The whole process probably took less than 30 seconds from when I handed her the ID. So it's very possible that person could receive that ID, look at the photo, look at the birth date, look at the person, and say, yes, these are all good, without really checking to make sure that that person is of age to cast a vote. That is extremely possible, and would also be another side really to go against voter ID laws, I guess you would say, just because they might not have that much of an actual hold on the election process. So that is a good idea or a good topic to bring up for voter IDs, but then at that point you're talking about training of that particular person. But I may be understanding what you're saying wrong too. So I wanted to quickly mention a procedure of the places that maybe not have a voter ID as well. So this goes on to say, even if you don't have a form of ID that your state asks for, you may be able to vote. Some states require you to take extra measures after you vote to make sure that your vote counts. Some states then you may ask to sign a form affirming your ID, performing your identity. Other states will let you cast a provisional ballot. States use provisional ballots when there is a question about voters' eligibility. I cannot read today. States keep provisional ballots separate until they decide whether they should count. To do so, they will investigate a voter's eligibility. Then they will be compelled to show you as an acceptable ID within a few days. So it just talks about how you're still able to vote without a voter ID. But I thought that also needed to be stated just to make sure that there are many states that simply don't have any sort of restriction as far as voting IDs go to cast a ballot. And I see here it says, and this is by Tank as well, he says, nah, not that much vote fraud really. If you are an 89-year-old grandma and a hardcore Republican or Democrat, he gives you $20 for a fake ID and $50 to vote, or the guy who issues fake IDs themselves. You could be a great voiceover for anything. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah, that's the biggest problem, and that was really what I was particularly talking about on my last stream about the history of voter fraud in particular. And I wanted to keep voter IDs as a separate topic because we're already a good 36 minutes into it, and we haven't even covered the majority of articles I have popped up. So that is why I wanted to completely make voter ID as a topic just by itself, and really if it has that much of an impact. But the main problem about voter fraud in particular is the human error and people being deceitful. It's not so much the actual impersonation vote, but at the same time you want to make sure that your impersonation vote makes the most sense. But I thought we would first get into this article, or not this article, but this video, and I have a video that's more pro voter ID and a video that's more anti against voter ID. So we'll go ahead and listen to those videos with some reaction and whatnot, and we'll go to our main articles and journals we have for everything. We are waiting for the computer. Okay, here we go.
Voter ID laws have become somewhat controversial over the last couple of decades because for a while states didn't have very many of them or didn't enforce them as strictly, but nowadays many states have enacted newer voter ID laws, many which require photo identification, many of which are strictly enforced.
These laws are controversial because on the one hand, proponents claim that they're needed in order to prevent fraud. On the other hand, opponents argue that they will keep some people from voting since a substantial portion of the population doesn't have ID, and will have an especially negative effect on participation by racial minorities and people who are poor.
Now, there's been a lot of litigation about voter identification laws and whether or not they're discriminatory. And for the most part, the courts have been mixed. They look at the particular jurisdiction, they look at the kinds of identification that are available to voters, they look at whether or not it's a strict or non-strict regime, whether it's a photo or non-photo regime, and depending on the evidence, what political science there is or what the recent electoral history is, courts have come out on both sides of the question. In some circumstances saying that the voter identification laws aren't discriminatory, and other places say they place too great a burden on certain populations of the public or maybe the voter public as a whole.
It's generally the...
So you saw that in a claim, and really the start of the video, he was talking about how some people think it leads to voter suppression, and we are going to get to that topic a little bit later. And really the next video also kind of talks about it briefly too. But I just saw one of your comments here. It says, it's weird that you could vote with anything but ID in the first place. And I see that claim largely from conservatives more than any other type of group. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad claim. And I do, in general, believe that claim as well. It is weird to think that you're able to cast a vote without proving that you're that person who's actually casting the vote. Many claims about voter fraud are people that are paid, or maybe not even paid, but have such a strong passion for that candidate that they are willing to claim themselves as Joe Smith, John Smith, Harry Smith, Derry Smith, whatever name they come up with. Probably changing the last name, but you get the point. Changing whatever name you want. and casting a vote many times for the same person. But most of the time, these sort of people that do that are paid by the candidate or maybe paid by an organization to boost up votes that way. And it's easy to do when you don't necessarily have to prove that you're the person who is casting that vote. So it makes sense in that way to have a voter ID just so you can make sure that you prove that that's the person who it is. But again, you're relying on that person at the polling place to look at that ID and make sure it's not fake and to make sure that you are that person. So it does still involve humans' needs or humans' perspective or how they're trained. But at the same time, it is just another step to make sure that you prevent any sort of fraud from happening in person. But we'll continue on with this video.
More severe or strict voter identification laws that get challenged in courts. Those are laws likely to exclude more people, obviously. The stricter the identification requirement, the more likely it is that some people won't have it and therefore will be burdened or disabled from voting.
On the one hand, we want to have secure elections. We want to prevent voter fraud. At the same time, we recognize that they can be barriers to access for those who lack an appropriate form of identification and might be turned away from the polls on election day. On the whole, these voter identification laws do little to burden voters, and therefore it's a reason why the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision in Crawford, concluded that these laws do pass constitutionally.
Don't explicitly prevent certain groups of people from voting, like poor people or racial minorities or felons. If a law imposes a significant burden on voting, the state should have to come up with a strong justification for such a law.
States have an interest in ensuring that elections are conducted with integrity. They want to prevent voter fraud, and they want to make sure that the public feels confident that when they cast a vote, their vote is meaningful and it's going to be effectively cast and counted at the end of the day.
The incidence of voter impersonation fraud, the only kind of fraud that a voter ID law is really going to prevent, is vanishingly small. If you look at where voter fraud actually occurs in real life, now it's not common in any form, but it most commonly occurs with absentee ballots. A voter identification law, which requires people to present photo ID or something like it when they go to the polls, it's not going to do anything about people submitting absentee ballots on behalf of other people who aren't really actual people or who didn't really vote their absentee ballots the way they've been marked.
Voter identification addresses a fairly narrow and
So yeah, that's all they were talking about there, but I thought I would include the claim about the absentee ballots as well, because really if you've been paying attention to any sort of recent politics especially, the absentee ballots are really the biggest, and mail-in ballots too for that matter, are really the biggest sort of fraud claims that are happening right now. And I don't know what you mean by my system, but I don't know. You should be able to hear it. I should have fixed that issue. I had problems with that a couple months ago where they couldn't hear the videos very well. But some of these videos are very quiet. And OBS doesn't like my computer very much. So I don't know if you're completely talking about the sound and or for that particular point. But anyway. But yeah, I'm just doing this in my bedroom right now if you're talking about the actual background. He says, I'm going to call my stupid Fez friend that he could have voted and be right back. I'm at the voting system. Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, the voting system is very weird. The laws that are there and everything is, you would think that it needs to change or at least be better. And I think that's why, if you believe Trump is doing this because he wants to overturn the election and become the president and that's his sole motivation, then you might not think or view it as this point. But I take a little different approach. If Trump is doing this to expose fraud and to show Americans just how big the system has become of fraud that is a interesting idea, and it's something that leads to people through legislation, or leads to the people wanting to change how the election system works and figuring out a system that's better and making sure that your vote is more secure and makes more sense. And hope you it does need a change.
We recently did an episode on how some states are enacting laws to discourage and prevent U.S. citizens from voting. And one of those laws, we pointed out, requires people to present a photo ID when they go to vote. And the comment section exploded. It was mainly people just wanting to know why requiring ID was a bad thing. After all, you needed to do pretty much everything else, so why not voting? While almost 11% of the US voting population does not have a photo ID. That's 3.2 million people. For me, that fact alone is enough to list voter ID requirements as laws that stop people from voting. But let's take a look at who those.
The only problem with that claim about the 3.2 million people is the actual rate of how many Americans physically cast a vote anyway, or cast a vote through a mail-in ballot or any sort of process where they actually physically cast a vote. So in other words, the amount of Americans that vote. The amount of Americans that vote are extremely low in turnout. So you could argue that the claim of making sure that less Americans vote is something that should be justified and does make sense. But at the same time, I don't think that those people she's particularly talking about are people that vote in the first place. So that's kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to that. And Tank says the system sucks really bad, and then perhaps because you have too many people over there. Do you live in the States, or you send a photo ID from Hawaii, so do you live in Hawaii then? I know some states are different. That's one thing that I talked about also as well, is that each state has slightly different voting laws and how voting is done. So it does lead to some states probably being better than others when it comes to how many votes are casted for that state and whatnot.
3.2 million people without voter ID actually are. The majority of them fall into 4 categories: young adults, the elderly, minorities, and the poor. 18% of all seniors and 25% of African Americans don't have a picture ID. If photo ID requirements were enacted in every US state, almost a fifth of the elderly population and a full quarter of the African American population would not be able to vote. Which begs the question, why can't they just get IDs? The people without IDs are the very same people that don't have driver's licenses. So they can't just drive on down to the DMV and pick up a photo ID.
So one quick claim about the voter ID through driver's license is, well, for one, it's not the only ID that's required to cast a ballot. My roommate this year was his first time voting, and he's 23 and also black, and he doesn't have a voter ID of driver's license because he can't drive yet. And but he was able to show, I believe it was his passport, and that was how he was able to vote in the election for this year. So there's just many different forms every state has that you can vote. You don't just have to have your driver's license to cast a ballot. And the idea of not getting a driver's license or voting ID that way doesn't particularly make too much sense either, because you'll hear her say about that, oh, it takes the whole day. You may not have the time for it to take a day. Well, that's just a bizarre claim.
Card. A lot of them live in rural areas that are nowhere near the closest DMV. Others may not have driver's licenses because they can't afford a car. They also can't afford to lose a day at work at the DMV, a place primarily known for wasting people's time. Plus, some states require a birth certificate to get a state-issued photo ID, while also requiring a photo ID to obtain a birth certificate. The law also limits absentee voting, which is how seniors who are unable to make it to the polls vote. And that is the truly alarming thing about voter ID laws. We're not talking about stopping people who don't vote from voting. We're talking about stopping active voters from voting. The elderly are the most consistent voters of any demographic. Minorities voted in the 2008 presidential election at virtually the same rate as non-minorities. And that same year, young people, ages 18 to 24, had the highest turnout for that age group since 1992. So is there an argument for requiring voter ID? The number one reason given for wanting it is to stop voter fraud. Supporters of the law want everyone to show an ID so that people can't just walk in off the street, say any name they want, and vote away, which would be a good reason to want voters to have ID if that were happening. But it's not. In fact, according to the Brennan Center at NYU School of Law, this type of voter fraud is less likely to happen than death by lightning. Obviously, we want to keep our elections fair, so we shouldn't completely discount voter fraud, but this new law simply isn't a good way to do that. To see our original episode on voter rights.
So I think a lot of her claims are very much claims to where she's talking about voter ID laws preventing people from voting. And it is one side to the issue, and really the biggest side you see against voting ID laws. But at the same time, like I've said really many times already, it's important that every vote is casted and is 100% for sure that it's that person. And I see that you You say over here you show anything with your name and birth date, and they check if you are the real person and if you already vote. I live in Middleland and voted. This is fucking insanity, which I agree. And then Tank also says, I don't think a person that doesn't have birth certificate or ID should decide my future. And it is a very big claim that I see. And I don't necessarily think that you were wrong, because I don't know if this may seem bad when I say it out loud, but I don't necessarily mean it that badly. But I was kind of mentioning it already beforehand. But the actual process of getting an ID is not that hard. And yes, it may take the whole day. But if you don't have a single day out of the year to get an ID, then it is a little weird. Even if you're someone that has to work all the time to pay for their bills, you live paycheck by paycheck because you have 8 kids and whatnot or whatever your situation might be. The actual process of getting the voter ID law or getting your ID is something that is important, and I think is not so hard that it shouldn't happen at all. If that makes sense. Basically, I think having a voter ID restriction for your state and making sure that you are that person is important for every election, and to make sure that all the elections are fair. So, taking that into account, although voter impersonation might be not that big of a number, or might not be a problem really, depending on how you look at the statistics of it, I think any vote that is casted more than once is something that needs to be taken care of. I think of it this way. I think every American in an ideal world would think that their vote they cast is for that person, and that the whole voting process through every state and an entire country was 100% what actually happened. In other words, there is not even a single instance of fraud. So if you can reduce the fraud as much as possible through voter ID laws, and it doesn't restrict a ton of people from voting, it is a very good idea. But the problem becomes with how many people does it restrict, and we're going to get to that side of the argument and think about that a little bit more. But the major claim, and something I've thought about, and I don't know if it makes 100% a claim that's good or 100% claim that's bad, but you hear the claim of, well, it doesn't take that much effort to get an ID, like I was just talking about. And it is true, but we are going to see arguments against that claim as well. So it is interesting that that happens for that point. Tank says, as well as if someone can't issue an ID because he's too busy supporting 5-member family and has 2 jobs, his vote is obviously going to be bought. Then Tank says, and if they don't have the time to issue an ID, it takes 2 hours to get administration, a total of 3 hours. How would they have the time to vote? That is an actual interesting claim you have there, Tank. And it is something I've also heard before. Many Democrats especially argue the fact that the way voting is done today doesn't allow certain communities to vote, such as the Latino or maybe black community, that on average tend to have more kids than the white community. And because they're working 2 jobs and living paycheck to paycheck, they simply don't have time to vote. So voting laws, or the way voting is done, should change to allow those people who are American citizens to vote as well. I've heard that claim, especially from more of the Democratic side, because in general, Democrats tend to have more of the minority votes than Republicans, so they're wanting to push for laws and strategies to allow for more candidates, or more of their candidates, to have a vote, because they don't have time of how the voting process works today. And that brings me to the argument I had a little bit earlier of potentially allowing for an entire day off for every American. But then again, you're talking about your essential workers, or people that have to work every day regardless of what day it is, including Christmas or including any sort of holiday, like your hospital workers, or in some cases your grocery workers, and stuff like that. Even though some grocery stores are off on Christmas, not every grocery store chain and whatnot is off on Christmas, because it is a potential for last minute shopping and for a big opportunity for the company to make money. And in the case of hospitals or police, you're never going to have a day off on those particular holidays, because you are there for a reason for anyone that gets sick or injured or anything in that point. So if you're one of those people in that position you may not have the opportunity to vote till after work. But then again, it's not like you are working all hours of voting from 7 p.m. to 7 p.m. or 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. or whatever your particular hours for polling is. It's not like you're going to work that entire time. So if you allow for the day off and you give every American the chance to vote, or more Americans the chance to vote, I think that is a good idea. And you could even say that Democrats have been pushing for that a little bit, but I don't know that much about what the Democratic strategies for allowing more people to vote who typically work more jobs is. And it would be interesting to look at, but we're not so much going to look into that for today's stream unless if it comes up in one of the articles. So this first article I have up here that opposes voter ID legislation is from the ACLU. And, well, you know about the ACLU. I don't think I need to talk about them too much. Let's read their background here. Voter identification laws are part of an ongoing strategy to roll back decades of progress on voting rights. 34 states have identification requirements at the polls. 7 states have strict voter ID laws, under which votes must present one of a limited set of forms of government-issued voter ID in order to cast a regular ballot, no expectations. Voter ID laws deprive many voters of the right to vote, reduce participation, and stand in direct opposition to the country's trend of including more Americans in the democratic process. Many Americans do not have have one of the forms of identification states available for voting. These voters are disproportionately low-income, racial, and ethnic minorities, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Such voters are more frequently have difficulty obtaining ID because they cannot afford or cannot obtain the underlying documents that are prerequisite to obtaining a government-issued photo ID card. Voter ID laws deprive many Americans the right to vote. Millions of Americans lack ID. 11% of U.S. citizens, or more than 21 million Americans, do not have government-issued photo identification. Obtaining ID costs money. Even if the ID is offered for free, voters must incur numerous costs, such as paying for birth certificates to apply for a government-issued ID. Underlying documents required to obtain ID cost money, a significant expense for lower-income Americans. The combined cost of a document fees, travel expenses, and waiting time are estimated to range from $75 to $175. The travel required is often a burden on people with disabilities. The elderly are those in rural areas without access to a car or public transportation. In Texas, some people in rural areas must travel 170 miles to reach the nearest ID office. And then Tank here says real quick, as well as if someone can't issue an ID because he is too busy. Oh, we already read that. And if they don't, yep, read that. Now, I don't know anything about institutions and abbreviations and so on. And then he says, Tank, as I told you, I live in Middleland. Oh yeah, well, the ACLU is an organization that basically they're an organization that looks at what people say and values what they say or don't say, but they are proven to be an organization that tends to lean very left compared to right. So they definitely have a bias that's more towards the left side of the aisle than the right side. So much so that many people have don't really trust anything about what the ACLU has to say. So using them as a source here, you have to take with a grain of salt. But you have to take that blog site that I mentioned at the start of this episode here with a grain of salt too. But basically, they're an organization that definitely has a bias. We go on here. Voter ID laws are discriminatory. Minority voters disproportionately lack ID. Nationally, up to 25% of the African American citizens of voting age lack government-issued voter ID compared to 8% of whites. Some states exclude forms of ID in a discriminatory discriminatory manner. Texas allows concealed weapon permits for voting, but does not accept student ID cards. Until its voter ID was struck down, North Carolina prevented public assistance IDs and state employee ID cards, which are disproportionately held by black voters. And until recently, Wisconsin permitted active duty military ID cards are prohibited veteran affair ID cards for voting. Voter ID laws are enforced in a discriminatory manner. A MIT study found that minority voters are more frequently questioned about IDs than are white voters. Voter ID laws reduce turnout among minority voters. Several studies, including a 2014 GAO study, that have found that voter ID laws have a particularly depressive effect on turnout among racial minorities and other vulnerable groups, worsening the participation gap between voters of color and whites. And Tank asking, which state am I from? I am from Texas. That's what state I live in. And I just quickly wanted to mention the fact that minorities tend to not have these sort of IDs. So we're going to get into actual physical statistics on that as well. And we also mentioned the counter argument to that. But one of the real things that I've heard, especially from a more democratic side of thinking, is that student ID should be allowed. And I don't know 100% why you wouldn't allow for a student ID. The only reason I can really think of why you wouldn't allow a school-issued ID is because they don't have those precautions like the government uses to make sure that that is authentic. In other words, it's much easier to fake a student ID card than it is to fake a driver's license. I don't know if that is the particular reason why these states don't allow for a student ID card, but that is the only reason I can really think of as to why you wouldn't allow a student ID card as a physical ID to make sure that you are that person who you say you are, because it does have your name. In some cases, it does have your date of birth on there, but well, my school ID for both schools that I've been a part of in college don't have a date of birth. So that may be an idea why they don't allow a student ID card as well, because it doesn't have your date of birth on there. But I'm sure that some student ID cards probably do have the date of birth, so it would depend on that too. But that's the only realistic way I could see how a student ID card for these states wouldn't be allowed, and it does make some sort of sense. But if you just want any sort of visual representation of that you're that person who votes, I do think a student ID card could work for that process too. But then again, it's interesting to see that side of the debate too. Tank says, why are there still considered minorities? Then he asks, only 30% of people below the age of 30 are white. And then says, cut 5% because of the Muslims. I mean, it is interesting, especially America. America is such a mixing pot of nationalities that, yes, there are minority populations, are populations that are less, which is like the black community or Latino community. Whites obviously have the largest percent of population when it comes to America, and to a lot of other nations, especially to a lot of other nations really, but let's just stick to America. Whites have a significant amount of population compared to other population or race groups, you could say. But I don't think that calling minority groups is that much of a difference as well. It is an interesting question of why these groups are still called minority voters, especially as America becomes more accepting of all, nationalities and whatnot. And you see a lot of like interracial couples now than in the past. So the idea of that Americans like only date with themselves, like their own race. In other words, the idea of America being super racist, as you could argue it was in the past, no longer really exists that much anymore, I would argue. So the idea of calling people minorities just seem a little bit weird. You should just call them the black vote or the Latino vote, and not just say, "Oh, that is a minority community," because in a way it does sound kind of bad. talks about here, voter ID requirements are a solution in search of a problem. In-person voter fraud is vanishingly rare. A recent study found that since 2000, there are only 31 credible allegations of voter impersonation, the only type of voter fraud that voter IDs could prevent during a period of time of which over 1 billion ballots were cast. Identify assistance of fraud or honest mistakes, so-called cases of in-person impersonation fraud, voter fraud, are almost always the product of election workers or voter making an honest mistake, that even these mistakes are extremely infrequent. Voter ID laws are a waste of taxpayer dollars. States incur sizable costs when implementing voter ID laws, including the cost of educating the public, training poll workers, and providing IDs to voters. Texas spent nearly $2 million on voter education and outreach efforts following the passage of its voter ID law. Indiana spent over $10 million to produce free ID cards between 2007 and 2010. So, excuse me, I don't necessarily agree with the last claim that this ACLU article was talking about. Is the idea of educating the public after you change a vote or change the way you're supposed to vote or a voting law is something that's important. If you change your law and don't tell the public that you changed the law, then that is voter fraud 100%. That is a person in the government restricting the amount of people who are able to vote, probably for a political reason, and it is something that is very bad and should not happen. And you see cases of that in the past with voter fraud through changing laws or getting people to vote for them and whatnot. So the idea of changing your law and spending a ton of money to tell people that you changed the law does make sense. That is something I think is important. So I don't think that argument of, it takes more money to educate people is that smart of an argument. You want to make sure that people are aware of how they're supposed to vote for their state. And the idea that Indiana spent over $10 million to produce free ID cards to these people makes even more sense, because if that's the only issue of why people can't have an ID card is because they can't afford it, then you have solved that problem, and you still make sure that you are that person you say you are through that photo, through your date of birth, and through where you live on it and whatnot. So then again, there you go. You solve that problem. So I don't agree with that last comment about the ACLU article here. And the C-Tank here says, I blame Spain for that, or was it Portuguese? It could be the cheap airlines. Yeah, maybe. Why are Latinos called Latinos, by the way? They are white enough for me. I don't know the history of why they're called Latinos, besides, I don't know any history really about the particular name that they're called for being Spanish and now Latino, but I don't know if that really means much anyway, so we'll continue on for this next one, but that is another interesting question for sure. So we'll get into this article here where it says why minority voters have a lower voter turnout in analysis of current restrictions. With ethnic and racial minority populations in the United States rising, there is a growing population of voters that remain unaccounted for. The current legislation has been implemented to ensure fair and impartial voting access. There is too much leeway given to state governors in the voting system execution. As a result, the restrictions in the election system have resulted in systemic discrimination towards minority populations, making them ineligible to vote. But I wanted to quickly mention real quick, and I think I might have already said this before, but I don't think it's bad to state again, and that is the fact of, is it a good idea to allow the states as individuals to change laws and to make their own guidelines for how that state is supposed to vote? And I do think that there are pro arguments and con arguments for that. Or should our voting process in the United States be much more federal-like and have mass federal restrictions or mass federal guidelines that you have to do in order to ensure that every state follows a system that allows for less voter fraud and allows for fair voting. So it allows for every American to have the opportunity to vote without any sort of fraud getting in the way. And Tanks goes on to say, vote for me on the next elections, and I'm going to separate them into, yeah, I don't know about that whole idea there you have. We'll go on to read this article here. Voter ID laws have an underlying racial bias and prevent minorities from engaging in active democratic participation. I do not know why they chose this font. This is a pretty terrible font. These requirements compel an individual to represent his or her idea in order to cast a ballot on election day. Obtaining an ID can be costly and requires individual's birth certificate, which may be burdensome. Proponents advocate for law under the guise of preventing voter fraud and ensuring that the only voter-eligible citizens partake in elections. However, individuals who lack government-issued identification are more likely to be younger, less educated, and impoverished, and most notably non-white. An example of the inherent discrimination of voter ID laws can be found on the implementation of Georgia's exact match system. This program requires the individual voting status to be suspended if the name on the driver's license or social security records does not exactly match the name they implemented on their voter registration form. With the 51,000 individuals with the law affected in 2018, 80% of them were African Americans. This is evidence that his exact match law played in the role in 2018 Georgia gubernatorial election, as African American candidate Stacey Abrams lost by approximately 55,000 votes. It is also far more difficult for members of minority communities to be able to locate polling places on election day. But real quick before I talk about that point, we have an academic journal on Georgia and the minority community through voter ID law, so we'll get into that. I think it's the last article, but we are definitely going to be talking about that claim in particular. But I'll continue on here. Only 5% of white survey respondents reported that they had trouble finding polling locations, compared to 15% of African American and 14% of Hispanic respondents. While deciding where to place a polling station, election officials are required to assign each precinct a design station focused on factors such as population, accessibility, and location recognition. Locations may be changed at the official's discretion. Minorities have a lower voter turnout compared to whites, and in many cases, this has resulted in discriminatory polling place distributions. Distributions in the polling place can be the result of a change in the minority of the election officials. Minority populations are more than likely to be left-leaning, and as a result, officials may shift polling locations to areas that are more representative of their political ideas. And the only claim about that what becomes a problem is the factor of, I think every official in government does that same thing. So it may have a slight leaning towards Republican if you believe the gerrymandering claims about voter fraud and whatnot, but at the same time there are definitely polling locations that Democrats decide to place. So it's on both sides of the aisle, so I don't know if it really means that much of a difference, but if you do agree with the statistics they found that minority voters are unaware of polling locations, that is somewhat interesting, because really it doesn't take that much time on the internet to come up with where your polling location is. Now, if these minority communities tend to be more poor and don't have access to the internet, that becomes a slightly different problem, and I'm not completely sure how you would solve that problem regardless of where your polling location is. So I'm not sure exactly what that article is trying to prove there. And Tank says, see you for sure. You're heading to bed? Alright, well, have a good sleep there then, for sure. And, yeah, have a good sleep. Thank you for showing up as well. Thank you. I highly appreciate that. Another major issue is the access to translated voting materials, which greatly decreases minority voter turnout. In communities that spoke little English, translated voting ballots were found to be responsible for increasing voter turnout by 11 points in the 2004 presidential election. In addition to increased voter turnout, the translated ballots allowed for higher voter engagement on all legislation, a concept known as voter fall-off, and it incentivized people who are at the polls to vote on more than one legislation and to answer more questions if the ballot is available in their native language. Often ballot proposition measures are reading intensive, making it difficult for minority language groups to fully comprehend and form an opinion on the proposed legislation. And the only claim against that I really can see is if you agree that minority voters are more likely to not be able to read, are more likely to be illiterate than whites, which I'm not 100% sure on the statistics for that, so I can't say for certain that claim is true. But then again, if you do agree with that claim and you believe that claim is true and the claim is true, then it's an interesting idea. But the only counter argument I can necessarily come up against it without necessarily knowing the full facts behind that statistic and making sure that it is true is that these laws are written in such a way that I would argue not many people understand at all, even if you're white, black, Hispanic, Asian, regardless of who you are, unless if you are a lawyer or someone that really understands law in your spare time through research, you are not going to understand most of what these laws have in them because they are written in such a way that only makes sense to really the people that make the laws, and even the people that are in government, I would argue, may not even understand most of the time what's in them as well because of the way they are written. So I don't know if it necessarily has so big of an impact, but you could argue that it does because any disadvantage a community has does need to be taken into account when it comes to voting and making sure that the elections are as fair as possible. So it is a claim you could very well go away with. We are waiting for this gesture to load up real quick. I don't know why it always signs me off like that. I need to figure out a way to not have that happen because I don't really want that to get out into the public too much, but I want to use these scientific journals as well. So I'm not 100% to do as far as that goes, but then again, I may just be trying to figure out something that, anyway. So this first scientific journal I have is The Problem with Voter Fraud. And I believe I read this on my last stream a little bit, but we'll go ahead and get to the actual parts here. We are going to go to the part where they talk about election outcomes without a voter ID and then election outcomes with a voter ID. And that is on page 754. We are going to 754 here. One second. Okay. Election outcomes without a voter ID law. Imagine an election with two candidates, A and B. A gets some number of lawful votes. A won, and B gets the rest of the lawful votes. B1, suppose A1 is greater than B1, meaning A should win. If A does win, then the outcome is acceptable rate, otherwise it is inaccurate. Will A win? The answer turns out on more than one lawful votes. It is also depends on fraud. Whether A and B are welcome and then are not, they each get fraudulent votes totaling AF and BF respectively. If A1 and B11 and AF is greater than BF, then A gets more lawful votes and more fraudulent votes than B. A wins and therefore the election is accurate. A should win because she leads in the lawful votes. Likewise, the election is not fraudulent because fraud votes don't determine the outcome. A wins whether the fraudulent votes make A's margin of victory deceptively large, but the outcome is accurate and non-fraudulent. Now suppose A1 is greater than B1 and AF is less than BF, meaning A gets more lawful votes but fewer fraudulent votes. A should win, but whether that happens depends on the specific vote totals. As A1 gets larger relative to B1, A's lead is lawful votes grows and B needs a sizable lead in fraudulent votes to win. Conversely, if A's lead in lawful votes is slight, then B's does not need any more fraudulent votes than A to overcome the deficit. If A wins, the election is accurate again. A leads in lawful votes and non-fraudulent. If B wins, the election is inaccurate. B trails in lawful votes and also fraudulent. B's lead in fraudulent votes must be deceptive. So that was kind of a major way, and although there was a ton of information all at once, and I had to read that myself before I read that to you guys here live on stream a couple of times to really understand exactly what they were saying with their claims. But they were basically talking about the different types of voter crowds and using the information of with voter fraud and without voter fraud, and we'll read a little bit later when they actually talk about the physical evidence of each as we read here. But essentially they're talking about the margin of error, and the margin of error most of the time depends on the gap between the two A's and B's and how many people have physically voted. But we'll continue on. More lawful votes than B, and moving right from the origin increases A's lead in lawful votes. The vertical axis represents the margin of fraudulent votes separating the candidates. At the origin, A and B have the same number of fraudulent votes. Above the origin, A leads in fraud, and below the origin, B leads in fraud. 1 second here. I want to make sure that I'm not missing anyone's comments on alternative platforms. Alright, we're looking good. So you see this axis, and those that are watching this on the podcast, if I decide to publish this part on the podcast or not. But anyway, before I just keep blabbering on, you have your vertical axis and your horizontal axis, and you have the accurate votes and you have the inaccurate votes with fraudulent outcomes. And you have 3 dots, and one of the dots is if everything runs smoothly, and the other 2 dots are if things don't run as smoothly, depending on the margin of error between the overall votes that were casted. And long story short, the graph is basically saying out of these possible 3 outcomes, only one outcome is right that doesn't have any example of voter fraud, while 2 other outcomes do have some sort of example with voter fraud. So then they're going to be talking about how that gap can happen because of voter ID laws and the problem with voter fraud in general. But now let's get to the election outcomes with a voter ID law. And that is, I think, what we're a little bit more interested in for today's stream and understanding if they do have an impact or not. So we'll read on. So far, inaccuracy and fraudulence have run together, but they need not to be that case. Envision 2 contrasts between A and B, an imaginary baseline election without an ID law and a real election with an ID law. The baseline election would proceed the usual way with produce some number of lawful and fraudulent votes for A, now denoted as A1 or AL, and AF, and likewise for B. The real election proceeds the same way with an important excuse me. Let me take a drink real quick. Man. Excuse me. Alright. The real election process leads the same way with the important expectation noted above. A voter ID law applies that law reduces fraudulent votes and also depresses some lawful votes in a real election. Then A gets a different number of lawful votes than she would have without a voter ID law. So this essay talks about this, but I don't want to read all of those numbers like I did the first time, because really that's not particularly what we're so much interested in the actual A1 this, A3 this, A11, AF, BF, whatever. We want to get to what the outcome of what was talked about. So we'll start here. Many others would conclude that A should win in this scenario. The debate over the ID assumes that the candidate should not benefit from depressed lawful votes. This is a view of opponents of laws who would worry that the depressing turnout will erroneously skew election outcomes. It is the view of supporters who agree that states must ensure that every eligible individual is able to vote and maintain that ID requirements do not reduce turnout. Courts have gotten into the act too of expressing skepticism towards strict voter ID laws. Judge Diane Wood of the 7th Circuit said, "Disfranchising even a tiny percentage of voters can be enough to swing election outcomes. Her concern is not with swinging outcomes per se, but with swinging them in depressing lawful votes. Because observers agree that candidates should not benefit from the depressed votes, it is necessary to push the point further. The aim is not to make normative claims, but rather to accept the convictions in this debate, and ID laws have certain effects, some of them good and others bad, and show how convictions, when combined and careful analyzed, can lead to supporting results. The candidate should not profit from depressed lawful votes in a convictional view. To connect these ideas with the definitions above, recall that election outcome is accurate if, after counting all relevant lawful votes, the candidate who should win does win. The category of relevant lawful votes include those that have not been cast, but the repressive events. Let's reread that. The category of relevant lawful votes includes those that would have been cast but for disruptive effects of the voter ID law. So the candidate with more lawful votes in the imaginary election should win the real election, and if she does, the real election is accurate. Suppose that A loses, then the election is inaccurate. A only trails in lawful votes because of the demand turnout, but the election is also non-fraudulent. B leads in lawful votes, and A's fraudulent votes are insufficient to close the gap. Fraud does not affect the outcome. So they were arguing that there's not enough, basically, impersonation fraud for the outcome to change on their data results on what they perceived. So that would be an outcome that if you believe that there's not enough voter fraud to ID to change the election, you would take kind of the judge's approach to voter ID laws. That yes, impersonation fraud is something that you don't want to see and you don't want to have. There's still not enough people that impersonate in elections for the fraud to make that much of a difference. So by having voter ID laws, you are now restricting people and giving them less of an opportunity to cast their vote. Americans don't really want to see in our elections. We want every vote to count, and we want more people to overall vote in elections. But, as we said many times already on this episode, you have to remember the account of making sure that every vote is who they say they are, and making sure that you believe that whatever election result happened is the actual result that happened, and having voter ID laws is a way, although the fraud may be limited, to reduce the fraud itself. So you do have to look at both sides, even when it comes to the alternative viewpoint for what many people have as far as voter ID laws happen. I don't know if it's going to make me sign this or not again. Okay, we are good. Yeah, I don't know why it keeps signing me out. I definitely have it to where it shouldn't be doing that. But I don't know. Sometimes it gets a little weird. So this is let's just read the title. It's Vote Fraud in the Eye of the Beholder, the Role of Public Opinion, and a Challenge to Voter Identification Requirements. So we are going to read some of this. We are going to go to Beliefs in Frequency of Voter Fraud, Voter Impersonation, and Vote Theft. And this is on 1742. We are on page 1738. We need to go to 1742. There we go. And this is by Harvard Law. So if you believe in Harvard, then you should take this seriously. But I do like using scientific journals and Google Scholar and all those sort of alternative viewpoints. And I wanted to save those towards the end here and kind of get some more of the opinion pieces out before we get into the actual analysis and types of voter fraud that we could experience due voter impersonation through scientific studies and research. Because as we've seen from our first article, really, they mentioned that that voter impersonation is so low that it's more likely to get struck by lightning, but it really depends on what take you take for the actual voter ID laws. If you're someone that thinks every vote should count and every American needs to make sure that you are who you say you are when you go to vote, then you would probably be for voter ID laws despite the voter impersonation rate being so low. But if you take a complete analysis review, or you think there should be more people to vote overall, then you would take the opposite approach to that claim. But we'll continue on with reading this Harvard article. even really depend on the existence of actual corruption, because awareness of the opportunities for abuse is sufficient to establish the state's interest, nor does an analysis based on such precautions necessarily imply that a particular remedy will be successful in removing them. The argument is similar when it comes to vote fraud. Rather than undertaking the more difficult task of proving its existence, it is much more easier to look at the system potentially for abuse and to point to public opinion that suggests that such abuse occurs with great frequency. In both contexts, one cannot gullible with the utter democratic value of such foreign affair. I lost my spot. It is much easier to look at a system's potential for abuse and to point out public opinion that it suggests such abuse occurs with great frequency. In both contexts, one cannot gullible with the democratic value of such feelings of legitimacy in the abstract. That is, few would prefer a state of affairs in which people see government as corrupt, or elections as rigged. However, if such opinions are insensitive to regularly regime changes, that is, campaign contribution restrictions or photo ID laws, then something else can be responsible for these general feelings of distrust. Finally, if the importance of these beliefs is more relationship to citizen engagement, then such relationship could easily be established by showing a correlation between such opinions and likelihood of voting. And this is the survey methodology, as they then did a study about people's trust in election fraud, because their general claim is the fact that this voter impersonation and voter ID laws don't really prevent voter fraud to the point that you should have voter ID laws. In other words, voter ID laws are not the reason that mass voter fraud could exist in our election system. So they wanted to go ahead and survey people on what they thought and what happened from voter fraud and what they see necessarily as the issue. But we'll read what they say about their survey after I have a quick drink here. Our study examined survey data from 2006, 2007, and 2008 to calculate how persuasive Americans believe vote fraud to be, understand whether such beliefs affect a person's likelihood of voting. YouGov Polymatrix of Palo Alto, California, conducted a national matched random sample surveys of American adults as part of the 2006 and 2007 cooperative congressional election studies. The 2006 study included questions about voter identification and voter turnout, and the 2007 survey included questions about respondents' perceptions of different types of voter fraud. For our study, YouGov Polymatrix conducted an additional survey in 2008 in order to probe respondents' beliefs about voter impersonation fraud in particular. Although respondents were selected through various interactive-based methods, the resulting sampling mirrored the main demographic characteristics: gender, age, education, race, religion, and income, and the political characteristics, especially party identification and ideological orientation of other surveys. Comparison of the sample with observed vote in 2006 provides a validity check on the sample methodology. The predicted division of the 2006 vote from the CCES sample forecasted election outcomes in the U.S. Senate and governor elections quite well. The CCES was designed primarily to study the 2006 election and public opinion of legislative politics, but it included some questions about voter identification. The overall study consisted of a 36,500 person survey conducted through the collaborative efforts of 37 universities organized in 35 teams. Each of the teams designed their own survey content to be administered to a 1,000 person sample. Questions common to all the teams, such as voter turnout, vote change, and various demographics, were polled into a common survey conducted under the same sampling frame and resulting in a large 36,500 person sample. A further sample of 10,000 respondents from the original 36,500 was done for a follow-up survey conducted in November 2007. The MIT team designed the content for one subset of this follow-up study, which included a question on non-citizen voting and double voting as a question regarding ballot tampering. And it goes on to talk a little bit more about those issues, but we want to get to the beliefs and frequency of voter fraud from those surveys. The survey questions concerning the frequency of election fraud attempted to gauge respondents' opinions on three distinct concerns: the illegal casting of votes by non-citizens, of casting of more than one ballot by a voter. We term this voter fraud. The second is the more relevant of the Crawford litigation concerns. An attempt of one voter to vote in the name of another. We term this voter impersonation. And that's the one we are really after, because that is what voter ID laws really control the most. Or that's the type of voter fraud that we see in, that voter ID laws are supposed to help. The next thing. The final phenomenon, which concerns stealing or tampering with votes one cast, is what we call vote theft. Go on here. So, version A asked half of the sample, very often, somewhat often, rarely, very rarely, or don't know. Version B asked, it is very common, it occurs occasionally, it occurs infrequently, it almost never occurs, and don't know. And that was to the question of voter fraud in 2008. Is it illegal to vote more than once in an election on to vote if not a U.S. citizen? How frequently do you think this occurs? The next question, vote theft 2007. Another form of fraud occurs when voters are stolen or tampered with. How frequently do you think such a vote fraud occurs? And then that was with the question of vote theft. And really the question we are after the most in this study is this question with voter impersonation. Is it illegal for a voter to claim to be another person who was registered and to cast that person's vote? How often do you think that occurs? The results from the survey appear in Table 1, and it has in 2007. So, for voter fraud question, 26% of people found that, 36% of people thought it was occasionally, 20% of people thought it was infrequently, but the biggest margin was that voter fraud with their first question occurred occasionally. But we are after the question of impersonation. So we want to go, there it is, voter impersonation. So the largest percent of voter impersonation they thought occurred somewhat often and occasionally. And hello there, Fluffy Boy, I see you there, thank you. How are you doing today, Mr. Fluffy there? Hopefully you're having a good day. I know that most people are, I think because it's break. I myself am very happy because I'm not in college right now, although I'm deciding to spend my time reading academic journals. So I don't know if that's really such a big break as it could be, but it is a very interesting idea. But that is a very interesting statistic that 32% of people think it occurs somewhat often, and it is very interesting. And we'll get into some of the data from it, but I want to see if we can skim through and find that part where they talk about voter impersonation. That is the only problem with scientific journals in general, is the fact that they tend to have a bunch of fluff for what we're actually trying to find. But we'll talk about some this point here, because it is another claim that a lot of people argue for voter impersonation are just for voter ID laws in general, and that is with the racial gap. So we see here, the racial gap in opinion concerning voter fraud and vote theft is much smaller than the ideology divide. In the 2007 survey, 60% of blacks and 21% of Hispanics and 27% of whites said fraud is very common. The 2008 survey showed no racial differences concerning beliefs in fraud. As for vote theft, 24% of whites and of blacks and 17% of Hispanics in the 2007 survey said it was very common. So there doesn't appear to be difference between the communities of people that think that voter fraud exists and think that voter fraud doesn't exist, or think it occurs frequently or doesn't think it occurs frequently. So that is rather interesting. So we want to go to the question. Here we go. Frequency of voter impersonation in 2008. 47% of people thought it occurred very often. So that is very interesting, that most people think when it comes to election fraud that it's through voter impersonation than anything else. But at the same time, when you think of the types of voter fraud, you probably think that voter impersonation would be the most common type, because that's the type where somebody claims that they are a different person, or goes to vote more than once through maybe even claiming to be the same person, and hoping that an error happens where they can actually physically cast a vote again or cast a vote twice. But the main part of impersonation is claiming to be someone else, or claiming to be that person that is either underage or can't physically cast a vote because they may be an illegal immigrant or a felon or whatever else comes from that point. So it does make sense that a lot of people would think that a voter impersonation is the most common type of fraud, but really through the last stream that I had yesterday and some of today, we found that most often the most common type of voter fraud is through human error, and people who work at polling stations are simply the mail-in ballots themselves, as there's more likely chance for the ballots to be lost through human error or other examples relating to it. So I thought that was a very good article to read based off of that evidence, but it doesn't appear to be a difference in racial communities to people that view voter fraud as existing or not. So it is something that is interesting, because in general, people believe these voter ID laws to target these sort of minority communities, but then voting the same as whites in that fraud could exist in a type of fraud that exists doesn't really surprise me too much, but it is something I did want to mention as well. And I don't think it really has that much of a difference, but again, I just wanted to be completely clear in mentioning that as an example as well. So these next two articles are about particular voter ID laws or legislation that has been passed within certain states. We have Kansas and we have Georgia. And the Georgia article, or the Georgia example, was also mentioned in our in an article before we got into all these scientific articles about the particular instance of where Georgia had a pretty big scheme of fraud or very harsh voter ID laws that the court then overturned. And that is my brief understanding of that. But we'll get much more detail once we get to our next article in our scientific journal. But I'll first read our abstract here. And this is titled Kansas Voter ID Laws, Advertising and Its Effect on Turnout. And this is by PRQ, Political Research Quarterly. And we'll go ahead and read their abstract. I don't know if you're still here, Fluffy Boy, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask your questions. I would definitely try to answer them to the best of my abilities. But really, I'm just trying to understand voter ID laws and voter turnout, on if they're good, if they should be allowed for states, if they shouldn't be allowed for states. The history of voter ID laws, how often does voter ID laws help voter fraud, questions like that. I'm just trying to understand the whole idea of voter ID laws themselves. So we'll read this abstract here. Previous studies have sought to assess the aggregate impact on new voter identification (ID) laws have on voter turnout. In this study, we extended on this research by considering how the advertising of voter ID laws can affect voter participation of these laws and how these participations may affect individuals' decisions to turn out. In Kansas, county clerks were given discretion on how advertise new voter ID laws, employ a quasi-experimental design and matching techniques. We examined these differences in country-level advertising. We found that the different advertising strategies can influence the impact voter ID laws have on turnout. So we're going to skip ahead here until we get to, in part, what I think is interesting and needs to be read. So we'll start with the voter ID laws in Pacific they have here. We're going to expand this a little bit for those who are viewing the information in person live and not on the podcast. Or it looks like we are maxed up, so we're not going to be able to extend. Sorry about that. So I don't know if you're going to be able to read with me for this one because the font is pretty small, but I'll continue on here. Voter ID laws. The controversial presidential election in 2000 renewed legislative interest in election rules, discussions, but terrified ballot handling chads and manual recount procedures dominated the news as election officials worked to determine who won the election following Bush's eventual victory in the 2000 election. Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, HAVA, which sought to replace punish card voting systems and provide more information election standards across the states. The act also required states to standardize voter registration process, poll working training, and election administration, but implementation of these have been left to the states, and different states have interpreted the act in different ways. And that is what I was discussing earlier, is a lot of times with our voter ID laws and just how the voting process works in America, is that states have the option to vote in whatever way they want to vote. And they can be able to change restrictions for their particular state. So our voting process here in America is not too much federal. It is changing, and it is interesting that every state can have different type of voting laws rather than, well, as I said before, a federal system. And I don't know if I necessarily, I don't know if I like the states being able to decide, or if there should be at least some minimal guidelines that the federal government should make. In general, I am more for giving states the opportunity to change laws for their particular people and their constituents and whatnot. I like that. I don't want the government to be bigger. I want the government to be smaller. So allowing states to make these laws is a interesting idea, and it's very much more of a federalist type of approach to government. And I do like that idea, and I do think that is smart. But I do think it leads to opportunity into states maybe abusing their power, especially if you are one that thinks that these harsh voter ID laws do prevent people from voting, which you can definitely see evidence for, but it just depends on how you want to view the situation. Voter ID laws and turnout. Initial studies examining voter ID laws have examined whether or not ID laws affect voter turnout. These studies report little to no aggregate reduction in turnout after states adapt voter ID laws. So, just from that brief claim that they have there, the voter ID laws have not affected, at least in Kansas and in local state, people's turnout to vote. So it is an interesting idea. If you think that these voter ID laws restrict people from voting, at least in Kansas, or their first statement here, shows that that may not even be the case. But then you go on to read a little bit more, and they mention a very wide claim that we've heard multiple times on today's stream as well. Although research has shown that minorities, the elderly, and the poor are less likely to process ID, political scientists find mixed evidence that leads to reduction in turnout for various subgroups of the electorate. Alvarez, Bailey, and Karts found no statistical significant difference in turnout between white and non-white voters, where Verdelecchio and Anderson in 2006 report that Hispanic voters in voter ID states are 10% less likely to vote than African Americans, are 6% less likely to vote than Hispanics, and African Americans in states without voter ID requirements. Both studies report reduced turnout among low education and low income voters. So it depends on whose study you trust the most. But the biggest problem about statistics is the fact that you can use the statistic and you can manipulate the statistic whatever way you really want it to be, especially when it comes to political statistics. So you could view those statistics in any direction, and that is a problem with statistics in general. But if the claim that they found is true through Bailey and Kotz and Alvarez, if I'm pronouncing their names right, would be that this voting turnout doesn't necessarily mean that people have a less opportunity to vote. And that would be, if that claim is true, then having voter ID laws themselves makes a bunch of sense and doesn't And there's really not even that much a claim against it. But then you have the other side to the argument of Anderson and Vinolicia. I probably butchered that. It seems Italian name. I'm not very good with names, as you can tell. But anyway, if you believe their claim, then it definitely affects more minority communities. And really, you've seen so many studies about voter ID laws that it does affect minority communities. We have a comment from I Love Cats 9,000. I think that's 900,000. I can't count the zeros from here. But he says, or she says, voter ID laws do nothing because elections are staged and decided decades in advance. I am not sure about the decades in advance claims, but you could definitely say that elections could be decided, especially when it comes to local elections more than political elections. But I argue the most that people should be paying attention more to their local officials than anything else, because their local officials and government officials are the ones that actually decide legislation that you're going to live with more than the actual president of the United States. That might seem odd to say, but that's just simply the case. And I Love Cats 900,000 says, focus on yourself and your family and those around you. Ballots are the worthless as toilet paper. Maybe not local elections, but all federal races. Yeah, see, it would be hard to rig all local elections as far as if you believe that they are rigged, which there's probably evidence for, especially if you're one to believe more conspiracies. Not saying that all conspiracies are wrong, but there's definitely a lot of conspiracies out there. But anyway, it's very hard to rig all local elections than it would be to rig a mass president type of election. Now, you would say that maybe it would be harder to rig a president than to rig a local election, and that's probably true. But then you have to get into the conspiracy side to things. But definitely local politics matters, and I would argue even more than the actual president of the United States. Let's see if we can find the part where they talk about IDs in particular. Let's see. We'll read from here. I like this one. So, they say here, alternatively, most county clerks use materials that strongly echo the I got voter ID message promoted by Secretary of State office. By the way, this is completely related to Kansas. And there are many states like Kansas that have these voter ID laws, but I do need to make that clear, those who are joining now, that this is in particular with Kansas. Put information on local paper and had information booths at the county fair informing voters that they would be required to take a photo ID to the polls to vote. Other county clerks did little to inform voters about the policy. We conducted each of the 105 Kansas County clerks and conducted a brief phone interview with each clerk. We were able to confirm that only Douglas County has a clerk who guaranteed advertising materials that differed in a substance from the Secretary of State advertising campaign. To access the impact of Douglas County, all votes would be conducted message. We compared turnout per precincts from 104 counties in Kansas that only received the I Got voter ID advertising control groups. With the turnout in Douglas County, precincts received with both all votes will be counted and Got voter ID advertising treatment group. We positize that voters receiving only the Got voter ID are less likely to vote. Alternatively, what we positize that residents receiving the additional all votes will be counted. Advertising will minimize turnout reductions associated with the new voter ID. I Love Cat says, nothing wrong with believing in a conspiracy, just research it first. Use your mind and be careful of disinformation and such. Yeah, of course. There are definitely some conspiracies that I think have some truth to them, and probably some conspiracies that are true. So, not all conspiracies are all, nut jobs, are like the flat earthers and whatnot. You may be a flat earther, but anyway, I don't want to get too sidetracked. I Love Cats also says, and make sure it doesn't gear you towards hating certain groups. Yeah, that is a very big point you have there. Even if they are the ones in power. Yeah, it is a very big point. Oftentimes, conspiracies try to pin you against a certain group or a certain type of people because they get, their type of people more fired up to do whatever they want them to do and whatnot. But that is something you do have to be careful about. It is a very good point you have there. Let's see. I don't want to spend too much time. We'll get into statistics here, but this article is very small print, and you can't even really see it on the screen. So we'll go to my last one I have as far as journals go, and I might spend a little bit more time on websites on Google, but I don't know if I'm necessarily going to do that because we kind of already covered that at the beginning with general thoughts about voter ID laws, because Google definitely its first couple pages and favors that voting ID laws shouldn't exist. So it is kind of interesting to see people's public opinions through journals on that. But they argued that voter turnout does not change much with voter ID laws in Kansas, especially the precincts that advertised more towards the new restriction. So that's an interesting idea, but we'll go ahead and move to my last scientific journal here, and this is in particular with Georgia, and they had a mass claim of voter fraud, so I thought it would be important to pull up exactly what happened with voter turnout with the black community in Georgia. And it may not be necessarily relating fully to voter ID laws, but there could definitely be some components of voter ID laws that are defined within it. I don't know if you're still here. I love cats, but definitely feel free to ask any questions if you have any questions. I am just kind of trying to understand voter ID laws in the past and voter ID laws now, and basically have the mass question of, do I think they're good? Do I think they're bad? Do they help elections? Do they hurt elections? But really, I've found that the difference becomes between, do you believe that voter impersonation is a big enough number of voter fraud to make voter ID laws not exist? Because the people that think that the number is so low, because like I've said many times, you're more likely to get struck by lightning than to have your election have voter impersonation. But if you want every vote to count and you want to trust every election 100% fully, then you probably would be for voter ID laws. And I think in general, myself, I'm probably leaning more towards thinking voter ID laws are good than bad, but there are definitely some sides that they could be affecting more the minority community than everybody themselves. I don't know if that makes full sense, but there are definitely claims out there for sure. So we'll go ahead and read the abstract here, and this is by Plyfon, and the title reads, Voter Identification and Voter Turnout, an Examination of Black Voter Turnout Patterns in Georgia, 2002-2014. The long-term impact of voter identification laws on black voter turnout has been a hotly debated issue for nearly a decade. Black voter turnout in Georgia is often held up as an example of how voter ID laws had no apparent impact on the black political participation. In this paper, I found that while turnout among black votes in Georgia fluctuates, turnout since the implementation of strict voter identification law is generally higher than a black turnout was immediately before strict voter ID requirements were enforced. Protecting the franchise is a very sensitive topic in African American political circles, in which a good reason voting rights was a central platform of the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 1960s. And in 2015, the efforts of those activists were memorialized, yeah, that's right, in public celebrations of the 15th anniversary of Voting Rights Act. This anniversary also conducted with the release of the critically acclaimed movie Selma, which reenacted the events of the Bloody Sunday March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. In popular parlance, Bloody Sunday served as the catalyst for ensuring the passage of Voting Rights Act. Moreover, the 15th anniversary of Voting Rights Act comes 2 years after the Supreme Court evaluated Section 4 of the current Voting Rights Act in the Supreme Court case Shelby Courtney v. Holder, 2013. thus rendering the preclearance provisions of Section 5, which required states with a history of voter discrimination to get any chance to their electoral systems approved by the Justice Department, unenforceable. In ongoing debate in voting rights circles revolving around whether any proposed change to voting systems in the United States have the actual or intended consequence of lowering African American voter turnout. In this paper, I examined the debate around new requirements that voters must show identification before they are allowed to vote. After a brief overview of the general themes surrounding the debate over voter identification laws, I proceed with a descriptive examination of voter turnout among registered black voters in Georgia from 2000 to 2014. The data shows that voter turnout was comparatively lower in the first federal election, which followed the passage of Georgia's voter identification law. However, voter turnout rates have suppressed their pre-voter identification law levels, which excitement over the consistency or candidacy of Barack Obama may explain part of its increase. The data suggests that regardless of the motivations behind passing voter identification laws in Georgia, the laws have not yet had a long-term devastating effect on black voter turnout. Not yet. Yeah, not yet. I was wanting to make sure I read that right. Alrighty, let me make sure I haven't missed any of your comments before I start to search through this article and get to the part that I have here. Hello, Ron. I see you on D-Live there. Gee, you have been on for almost 2 hours. Wow, I guess I missed and noticed. Yeah, they've been on 2 hours exactly now. I don't know when you exactly sent that. But yeah, you were here yesterday, so you might know what I'm doing here. But basically, I'm talking in specific about voter ID laws, on if I think that they are suppressive to the black community or Latino community, or do I think they're good or bad in general, that type of whole thought process. Right now, I'm leaning towards that I think voter ID laws are good. The biggest claim against voter ID laws that I think is the biggest claim, or the one that makes most sense to me, is that essentially the chance of voter impersonation is so low in an election that you're more likely to get struck by lightning. But the biggest argument I think against that, and really the argument I take on the whole situation, is that I want the elections to be as most fair as possible. And I haven't seen enough real evidence to persuade me in thinking that the voter IDs are so outweighed that they prevent people from voting too much. Now, I think that America should change their general process of elections to allow for more people to vote, such as maybe having the day off. I don't know if you'll necessarily do like what Australia does, while having to make every person have a vote, where even if you don't know who you're voting for, they have an option for you by basically saying, I don't know, but you still have to cast a ballot. I don't know if America's ever going to get that way, just because of how America has been formed and everything. But that's kind of what I'm talking about for today. But I haven't really seen enough evidence to me to suggest that voter ID laws are so outweighed against minority communities. But if you do believe the numbers out there, and you think that every person in the minority communities or every person in general should have the right to vote, I can very much see you in saying that voter ID laws shouldn't happen just because the idea of the rate being so low. But I want every vote to count, so it's kind of a power struggle within those two claims. But I'm trying to find their evidence here. So we have their snapshots here. It says all black registered voters. 62.8% in 2000 was the turnout. In 2004, it was 72.6%. In 2008, it was 75.8%. And in 2012, it was 72.6% between all black registered voters. And you get into the specifics there. Now the turnout in the midterm congressional elections. Now turnout on average is much lower in midterm elections than in presidential elections, which is something that has a whole other issue within itself, because it is important that people pay attention to local politics. I've already said this before, but I do think it needs to be stated again. People need to be paying more attention to their local politics than in presidential politics, because your local legislators, your local representatives, your local congressman, your local governor, your local mayor and whatnot is the person that mainly signs laws and passes laws that affect you. But federal legislation and federal laws is something that should be paid attention to, but local elections do matter. So we'll get into their statistics here, where they say that all black registered voters in 2002 was 47.6%. In 2006, it was 42.9%. In 2010, it was 50.4%. And in 2014, it was 47.8%. I see Ron here says, I'm going to make sure I don't miss anything from your comments before. Oops. There he goes. Oh, I went too far. If a voter has a voter registration card, then I don't see why it would be unnecessary to show an ID. The card is checked on the roster. Yeah, that's how my roommate voted this year. He got a voter registration card, and I think he might have had his passport too, just in case, because he can't drive, so he doesn't have a driver's license, because the majority of people that have to vote with a voter ID, such as in Texas here, you show your driver's license, because most of the people who got to that polling station drove. So that's kind of what with that claim. Then Ron says, one voted. That is how it's done here in Oklahoma. Then Ron goes on to say, usually one goes to the lag agency to register to vote. It has been a while, so I don't know if an ID is required when requesting a voter card. But if so, it does seem only fair to others who have provided they are eligible to vote to not have their vote canceled by non-citizens or felons who have excluded in most states from voting. I think that once somebody finishes their time, they should have all their rights restored, and that is everything. Firearm ownership, voting, etc. Yeah, for sure. I had someone earlier in the stream today that was basically thinking, I don't think he was from the United States. He said Midtown or mid country, I think he said. So I think he's foreign. He didn't say he was from the United States, but he was basically trying to understand our voting process here in America, and he thought it was kind of weird that some states didn't require you to have a voter ID. And he also was kind of having some claims, and I talked about earlier, that you could have a fake ID, because really when it comes to voting fraud, it's fraud between your candidate themselves, and it's fraud between people's error through the polling worker or whatnot in that type of format. So that's kind of your main two errors. In the actual process of someone getting away with it without any error without any human error is kind of doesn't happen very often. So that's kind of interesting for his point and what he was trying to understand. But the act of having a voter ID card is something that's interesting. Now, I was also debating a little bit earlier in this stream is some states didn't require a photo ID, but required an ID such as a bank statement. And I don't know if that makes entirely too much sense to me, because all you're really proving with a bank statement is your address and maybe your date of birth, but it doesn't have any sort of photo ID along with your bank statement. And I do think that a photo ID does matter, because you're able to put a visual confirmation on that person rather than just an address, because I do think it was much easier to fake a bank statement than it is to fake an ID card, even though both ways are possible. But we'll go on reading from this article. Let's see if we can zoom a little bit more. Whoop. Uh-oh. Maybe too much. Oh, yeah. Now we're zoomed. I think that's a little too much. We're going to backtrack a little bit. All right. Identification was passed in Georgia. However, that law was enjoined by the courts until 2007. We see that among all black voters and among black men and women, voter turnout rates do fall from 2002 to 2006. However, voter turnout rates increased in 2010. And while 2014 turnout is lower than 2010 turnout, 2014 turnout is still higher than turnout in 2006 before strict voter identification went into effect in Georgia. I now turn to the examination of the relationship between place type and the racial composition of a country and black voter turnout. The purpose of such an examination is twofold. First, others have argued the social economical factors are more highly predictive of voter turnout than presence of voter identification laws. By comparing black voter turnout rates among urban and rural areas, we may find variation based on the type of place. Similarly, turnout rates over time may vary depending on the concentration of blacks in a country. Table 2 presents black voter turnout rates in presidential and midterm elections based on the racial composition of voters and the degree to which a country is in the urban area or not. Here are present aggregate turnout rates of all of the countries who met each particular characteristic as opposed to presenting an average turnout rate for each class of country. Ron says here, right, bank statement is not enough. You can be a resident alien with a SS number and have a bank account here, but one is still not eligible to vote here. Exactly, yeah. And one issue, or potential issue, is that states have the right to change voting laws for their particular state. And it's not a federal system, but at the same time, I don't know if I necessarily think that it should be a federal system, as I was explaining earlier, so I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. But when you talk about not having to show a photo ID, it is much easier to fake a bank statement or any sort of document that doesn't have a photo ID. So I don't think that states that require a photo ID are necessarily that bad. And in some cases, the states were even offering free IDs for people that can't afford the ID for some matter of time, just to avoid that sort of political adversary component to that state. I think it was Indiana. Yes, it was Indiana that was allowing for free IDs, because all they were really after was giving a government-issued ID to these people that they could then identify them for voting, and that was their main focus. And it makes sense in a large way. And Texas spent a whole bunch of money in advertising when they changed their voting restrictions to where you had to have a voter ID. And I'm sure Oklahoma, where Ron is, did the same thing. Because one of the articles was arguing that was something against it. And I'm like, well, if you change your voter ID law, you have to make sure that you let your communities know about it. Because if you change it and don't let your communities know about that new restriction, then you are probably doing some sort of fraud. And it's not something that's good. So the idea that these states had to spend a ton of money in advertising to make sure that their constituents and stuff knew about the change doesn't make sense as a negative claim against why you shouldn't have voter ID laws, as an article was trying to claim earlier. And Ron says, I don't anybody should think that allowing non-citizens to vote is a good idea. It is not. You don't weaken your country with foreign vote. And yeah, that is the biggest claim about really having voter IDs in the first place, is the fact that they prevent illegal aliens or non-citizens, which kind of the same thing, whatever way you want to say it, or felons from voting. But it's also voter ID laws prevent the citizen from voting more than once. So when you're talking about voter impersonation, they're mainly talking about somebody trying to claim multiple identities, either by voting multiple times or saying like, oh, I'm John Smith, and then he turns into Terry Loso or John Henry. You know what I mean? Just random names and going to multiple different types of locations to cast a ballot. And voter ID laws could restrict that. But those statistics don't take into account felon votes and illegal votes that could vote much easier without a voter ID. And one of the claims against the voter ID laws is that it targets the minority community. But at the same time, I don't necessarily see a citizen of the minority community who is a citizen having that much of a hard time getting a physical ID compared to someone who is a felon or illegal immigrant, as obviously that would have a much harder time getting a valid government ID if you are an illegal immigrant. Ron goes on to say, I don't think anybody should think Low left out a word. Yeah, I got what you were saying. I got your general gist. I make typos all the time, so. We go on here. I can't remember if I read this or not, but we'll go on and read it again. Presenting an average turnout rate for each class of country in absolute terms, Some counties have very few black registered voters. It was not unusual for these countries to have an extremely high or extremely low voter turnout rates based on the behavior of a handful of voters. By basing percentage turnout on the aggregate turnout of blacks in each class of countries, I minimize the effect of outliers. And this is looking at Georgia in particular about their strict voter ID laws. But we'll go on. First, I look at turnout rate among countries with different with different racial compositions based on 2010 census data. I compared counties from where less than 15% of the overall population, N equals 43, was black to counties where 15% to less than 30% of the population was black, N equals 51. I also look at the counties with a black population between 30 and 44.9%, N equals 39, and countries where 45% or more of the population is black, N equals 27. The same turnout pattern that was observed in Table 1 holds when we compare turnout rates across the country. Groups with different considerations of black residents. The official turnout rates in countries with very small black populations and counties with larger black populations increased from 2002 to 2008 and decreased significantly in 2012. In midterm elections, turnout rates fall from 2002 to 2006. Ron says you can't even get a job, rent a place, or borrow money, etc. without an ID in this country, so I don't see how it is disfranchising minorities. I would rather that we didn't have to show IDs, but that is how screwed up the government has made things. And then Ron says, if we had a government that had a lot less power, then nobody would care who was in power. But right now we are faced with a stolen election. There are plenty of smoke that proves that. If this was allowed to happen, then and I'm assuming he's going to type some more about that part of the debate. But yeah, I agree with all of what you have to say there. The biggest claim the biggest claim about voter ID laws that doesn't make sense yet to me is why is there so much struggle to get a voter ID law in the first place? And maybe I don't understand the type of community that it's affecting more, or I don't understand the people it might be affecting. You do definitely have a percentage of crowd that works 2 jobs and has a significant amount of kids and just doesn't have time any day to do something. But I don't think that population of people is specifically one set of group, and that one set of group is unable to get IDs because of it. In other words, I don't think that type of person affects one sort of community more than the other. Now, you can argue that blacks are more likely to have more kids. I've seen several statistics about that, and that's why the black community may not have more time and therefore can't get voter ID laws because they don't have enough time in the day. But I just don't see that many portion of people being affected and wanting to vote, because the vote out rate in general for the United States is super low. So I don't think the combination of factors is so great that these people are now going to go against voting in general. I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense here, but I just don't see the claim that a lot of Democrats make that voter ID laws are so hard that they disfranchise minority communities just because of that. And Ron says, I think I have to go up a little bit here. No, here we go. Then there will be bigger government programs. The big green still. We don't need to keep moving up. We don't need to keep moving to the left. We need to be undoing all of the government social engineering. That is a big, big claim. By the way, Ron, I am going to be doing a stream of the Green New Deal, or the Green New Deal, as it's referred to. I don't know exactly when I'm going to do that stream. Probably this week, though. Probably maybe Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, one of those days. Probably more likely Friday than any of the days before. But I'm definitely going to be talking about that because I do think it's something I want to address on a stream with kind of a long form deal, because there's a lot of things to talk about when it comes to the Green New Deal. But we'll get into some statistics here with their table. Their table 2 has black turnout in Georgia by aggregate county racial composition and place type. The presidential election percentage in 2000, less than 50% black was 58.1%, while 15% to less than 30% black was 62.8%. Then you have all the way from 2012, where they have 71.0 is less than 15%, 74.0 is less than 15 to less than 30% black. That is very hard to say. We don't need, no, I already read that. We have a super low turnout in this country, yet in the contested voting districts, they have 80 to 100% voter turnout. Yeah, that is the weirdest claim when it comes to voter fraud in this election. And in some counties, you had over 100% of participation, which is literally statistically impossible. So the thought that that many people are going to vote is a rather interesting claim, because I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Yes, both candidates and this election cycle was so partisan that I do think a ton of people came out to vote, and I can see that one of the candidates did have the biggest turnout rate ever in the United States election history, but I don't really see both candidates getting that number of the highest election turnout in history. That is very odd to me. And the idea that you could potentially have 80% of people turning out is possible just because of how divisive the people were. But to have 100% turnout makes literally almost impossible sense, because I don't know the exact statistic. I believe it's either 50% or less of people vote in the United States election overall when you take all of the population. So to think that that many people are going to vote in particular doesn't make any sense at all. In other words, I just don't really see 80% of people in certain counties voting. That just doesn't make much sense to me, let alone the 100% number, and of course not the over 100%, as that is statistically impossible. And I'm probably either going to be doing a YouTube video or a live stream about particular news, maybe this week or next week, where we go over these claims, and hopefully we'll have some more evidence through lawsuits that Trump has had, because Trump and his legal team have been talking a lot about things they have found, but we have yet to see really evidence come from it in particular. So I'm really waiting for those claims to be settled, even though we may not know for a long time about those claims being settled, as the court system takes a very long time to decide on things. Let's see if I can find a summary here. We don't need to read all of this. We might be reading the conclusion. I don't know what they have after. We'll read the conclusion. Yeah, we'll read the conclusion. I don't think we need to read all the parts in between because it is a little bit repetitious, but I might. No, I don't know. We'll see. Conclusion. In general, this study presents one small challenge to the controversial wisdom that voter identification laws had no effect on black voter turnout in Georgia. While it is true that black voter turnout has increased since the implementation of strict voter identification laws in Georgia, that increase occurred after an initial decrease in black voter turnout. We have to consider the possibility that voter identification laws may have been initially correlated with lower black voter turnout. That being said, that black voter turnout rebounded in Georgia suggests that even if some legislators had desired to depress Democratic and by extension black voter turnout, their efforts failed in the long term. Barack Obama's historic presidential candidacy may have offset the inconvenience of voter identification laws. As President Obama resides from the political stage, we will have the opportunity to see if black voter turnout plummets, and if reports of blacks have been increased, difficulty voting increase. That's a weird sentence. Let me read that. I probably read that sentence wrong. Let's read that again. We will have the opportunity to see if black voter turnout plummets, and if reports of blacks having increased difficulty voting increase. I feel like they could have worded that last sentence a little better, but maybe I'm just getting tired here and not reading right. But so it'll be interesting to see if this person or if some sort of study comes out newer. This is the only really study I can find in particular that talked about voter ID laws in particular with a certain state. because I wanted to pick a state that was more strict on these voter ID laws and see if they really did have an impact. Now, our claim about Barack Obama coming out and increasing black vote could be true, and the difference could make the difference between there not really being much of a difference between people who vote who are black and voter ID laws supposedly suppressing them. But if these claims don't lessen in this election cycle, because this article is older, it'll be interesting to see new evidence, basically. And I don't, if you think these claims are true, and you think maybe Obama did help, but doesn't necessarily help too much, because blacks were like, okay, I'll have to get a voter ID law now, or have to get a voter, restart. If you think that Obama did increase the black population, which is probably very likely, the blacks either had to manage to get a new ID or find their ID or basically figure out what they were going to do. And if you assume that most of these blacks who are voting don't have an ID, then they had to get an ID, and they still had to turn out for the election. So Obama may have increased the desire for the community to go out and get IDs, but if you believe that the evidence wasn't that much because of Obama and just was because people wanted to vote in an election and got their IDs, then the actual process in Georgia of strict voter ID laws did not affect the election. It would make voter ID laws make sense for every state to necessarily have, if you believe those claims as truthful. And it'll be interesting to see new data off of Georgia if that is the case. But I think that voter ID laws make more sense than they don't make sense. So that is kind of interesting. So to conclude this entire live stream on voter ID laws, it ultimately comes on your perspective. The chances of voter impersonation that voter ID laws infects is so low that you're more likely to get struck by lightning. So if you take that approach, and you also take the approach that it's more likely to target minority communities off of simply the fact that they are no longer able to get there to vote because they are elderly, or because blacks or Latinos are less likely to have voter ID, or less likely to have IDs, then you might take the approach that voter IDs do restrict the amount of people that are overall able to vote. But if you take the approach that you are someone that wants every election to be as fair as possible or as pure as possible, then you would want voter ID laws to happen across all states. And it also can include the effort that I hear from a lot of people that the process of getting an ID, although it is painful because the DNC is so bad, it's still so easy to get that it shouldn't really prevent you from casting a vote. But you can obviously take the approach that every vote should count. Therefore, having voter ID laws could restrict the amount of people to vote. Therefore, you shouldn't have voter ID laws. I just don't really see that perspective myself. So I myself, at the end of all of this, still think that voter ID laws should happen across all states because it just makes sense, even if the number of voter impersonation is so low. Ron Helton says here, no mail-in ballots should be allowed ever. Trump said it was a problem. Others in the past years, Jimmy Carter said it was a problem. Vote in person or don't vote. All legal votes should be counted. And I agree with all of those claims for sure. And what's kind of funny, and not to go too off on a side tangent, but even Democrats were saying that the mail-in ballot process was an idea that could lead to fraud, especially when it comes to the Dominion software that was happening in this election cycle. Amy Klobuchar, John Oliver, although he's not a politician, he is most definitely a leftist figure and a comedian for that matter. But he was even talking about how the Dominion software gives opportunity for voter fraud. So even Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren and those far leftists are just left figures in general were mentioning that voter fraud could exist. So if you knew that this voter fraud could exist, then why in the hell did you use the Dominion software for this election cycle? It makes absolutely no sense. And that's why I think it is very important to do a live stream just based off of election fraud that is happening now. And I think you could do multiple live streams just based off of that. So that's kind of where I conclude with voter ID laws now. And I'll quickly mention that I am going to be doing my podcast tomorrow, Wednesday. I don't know exactly when I'm going to be able to do so because I do have to take my mom to the airport. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing it midday or more later in the day or maybe early morning. Probably most likely going to be later in the day, probably around dinner time. For news of this week and probably last week because I missed a podcast beforehand. And then on Thursday around midday, I'm going to be doing a weekly show with Anna Voltes. And we are also having a special guest who is a doctor, Doc Midnight, or Dr. Round Midnight on Twitch. And we are going to discuss COVID-19 in general, but mainly the vaccine and news of the vaccine that has recently come out of this week and last couple weeks. So that is going to be on Thursday around midday. And then on Friday, I'm probably going to be doing a Green New Deal stream or maybe another fraud stream. I think I'm going to mix it up and do a Green New Deal stream because there is just so much evidence and it's kind of a topic I want to talk about and change it up a little bit. But I'm definitely going to be doing another voter fraud stream about the specifics of voter fraud allegations that are happening now. So I will be looking forward to that as well. I don't know if that's going to be this week, but it's definitely something that I am going to discuss. I am waiting for more physical evidence from Trump's lawyers and all of that on if his claims are truthful. But if you watched the stream yesterday, you saw several claims of voter fraud that are happening now that just you should just be shaking your head out, including in Georgia, where someone filmed a group of people putting these ballots through a shredder, and it is very bizarre. I do not see why you would ever want to put ballots through a shredder, and it is just extremely suspicious. And I see Ron Helton here. Thank you for the ice cream again, Ron. I highly appreciate that. And he also says, well, I hope to catch the beginning tomorrow. Yeah, definitely. I don't know exactly when I'm going to be doing my podcast tomorrow, but probably, like I said, around dinner time. So I hope to see you there, Ron, and anyone else who may be listening there. But also, before I leave there, I just remembered I am going to be making a summary of both of these streams to put on my YouTube channel, The Roundtable. That was my old name. To put on my YouTube, The Breakdown with Birkenhoff. So I'd be looking forward to that. I don't know if I'm going to include them in one stream. It may get too long if I try to include both into one. So there may be two separate short versions of basically what I took away from this fraud election stream / investigation I've been doing. And I am still working on my documentary. I'm pretty much finished with it as far as the analysis goes. But I don't really want to post it till all this election stuff is over with. So I may not be posting it till January. Although it is very late, I still think it's very relevant to what is happening now. I might change my mind. I just don't think it's really a good time to post something like that as of right now. But again, I might change my mind. But again, I'll be on my YouTube channel whenever I decide to release that video. So again, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy your day, and catch you later.